Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Everything Technology Podcast. I'm Bob O'Donnell, the host of the podcast. I'm also the founder and chief analyst at TECHnalysis Research. And what I'm going to do with this Everything Technology Podcast is try to provide some context and information around tech industry news. You know, there's a lot of sources for news that you can find on the web and all over the place, but not all of them have the context to give you the meaning, to help you understand the importance or, frankly, unimportance of certain news items versus another. So my goal with this podcast is, in fact, to provide that perspective. I've been a tech industry analyst for over 20 years. I write regularly for USA Today, for Forbes, for LinkedIn, for TechSpot, for Seeking Alpha, lots of other places. I advise a lot of big tech industry companies. I'm called on by the media to comment on tech issues. And what I'm going to do here on Everything Technology is indeed provide some... Yes, indeed. I'm going to give some analysis on what's going on. And by the way, extra musical points if you can name the artist and the band who provided that little musical snippet. But anyway, look, I want to have some fun with this. I want to try and provide a little personality and perspective to the tech industry news. And the format of the show is pretty simple. First half, about 15 minutes. Tech industry news and what's going on, my take on some of those developments. Occasionally going to have some other folks join me as well. Second half of the program is going to be an interview with somebody from a tech company or perhaps another analyst or somebody else involved in the tech industry, again, to kind of dig deeper into some of the big issues of the day. This week, I'm pleased to be able to talk to someone from Verizon on 5G, so we'll get to that later in the program. But first, let's talk about the big tech industry news of the week. And what did we start off with? Of course, Apple's WWDC, their Worldwide Developer Conference, happened this week. And, you know, there was a lot of expectations, a lot of hope, frankly, that they would introduce some new hardware or some new chips or something related to that, but none of that. Nevertheless, there was a lot of cool stuff. I did find it interesting that Apple started their WWDC event this year with iOS. You know, now iOS, of course, has been the bread and butter of Apple because of the success of the iPhone, frankly, for most of the last 10 years. But as we've seen over the pandemic, you know, things like PCs and the Mac, by the way, become very important. And of course, it was rather interesting that Apple, in fact, ended their event with news on macOS Monterey, which is the code name or the actual product name for the next version of macOS. But in between, there was a lot of stuff. So a lot of what we saw was frankly relatively straightforward. A lot of new features. I mean, I found myself as I watched the event, especially on the iOS side, going, wow, that's cool, but how are you going to remember that and that and that and that? All these ways to integrate services, to add Apple Music to Memories, for example, which is the photo album capability. All sorts of interesting stuff. However, there were a couple of surprises. Apple didn't make a lot of noise about them, but it was a big deal. Number one, FaceTime. So those of you who know that FaceTime is a great service for doing video calls if you live in a Apple-only world. Problem is, the vast majority of the world does not, right? People have got Android devices, they've got Windows PCs, what have you. So at WWDC, Apple announced the fact that you're going to be able to do FaceTime calls via a browser on a Windows machine and on Android devices. And look, that's a big deal. Because for a lot of people, FaceTime was one of those things. You know, we still have green bubbles in iMessage that as a differentiating platform perspective. But FaceTime calls was a big deal, especially for families, you know, who had a combination of devices or families and friends or colleagues. And frankly, I think part of what happened here, and I saw somebody commenting on this on Twitter or somewhere, I forget, and I think they're absolutely right, is, look, in the pandemic, we've all done video calls. We're doing all of these things, but Apple is losing ground because everybody's now just saying, you know what? Hey, if I want to do a call on an Apple device, I'll use Zoom or I'll use one of these other platforms. The only way you can survive today is, in fact, to have a multi-platform video communication system. So in essence, that's what they're doing with FaceTime, which I think is an interesting step and a recognition by Apple that they need to do that. A couple other interesting things. On the watch side, a lot of emphasis on health. Now, and what's interesting is a longtime Apple observer, remember when that watch first came out, everybody's like, oh, they've hired all these doctors and medical people that are really going to make a big push into medicine. Well, to be honest with you, here we are 5 years later or so, and that really hasn't happened. However, at this WWDC, we actually did see more of the capabilities that I think a lot of us expected, frankly, 4 or 5 years ago on the watch, in terms of being able to do things like walk steadiness and sharing medical record data. I mean, you have to, give people permission to do so, but really starting to integrate more into people's health-based information and do more diagnostic capabilities that I think a lot of people hoped Apple would do sooner. But still, it's an important step in the right direction. Apple Watch continues to sell very well, and it keeps plugging away and making more and more of an impact. So I think what we saw today, or this week, I should say, at WWDC, was a preview of where Apple is going on that medical device side and integrating themselves into the medical world. A couple other interesting things had to do with Siri, of all things. Number one, they announced that you're going to be able to have access to Siri through other devices. Although, when you dug a little deeper, it turns out it wasn't quite as revolutionary as they first thought. Basically, a device will pass over that can you can say, hey, Siri. Another device may have Siri, but it actually sends the request to an iOS device that's nearby that's actually running Siri. But to that end, the other big thing, and we're starting to see Amazon and other folks do this too, is on-device recognition. This is a huge deal across the board for not only for Apple, but for all these devices, because one of the problems people have had with all the voice-based assistants is they take your recordings or whatever you say, they send them up to the cloud, and then they're analyzed, and then it comes back. Well, of course, that means your information goes to the cloud, and we've seen issues with recordings going places they shouldn't go and people hearing things they shouldn't hear. So it was very interesting to see that Apple was now starting to do on-device recognition, which means, less of your data goes into the cloud. Again, Apple's not unique in doing this, but it's an important step forward for them. And frankly, it was part of the bigger story of WWDC as well, which was around privacy and security. Apple made a big point with their app transparency rulings or regulations, whatever we want to call them, that basically is informing people of all the things that apps are doing, which are terrible, by the way. This is fantastic for Apple to do that, because Apple's now encouraging Google to do it, because we're starting to see Google do this for Android, because this is a problem. It's gotten way out of hand. There's so much tracking of things that we don't even know about that Apple is simply bringing to the surface. And so they built on that. They also added a new security-related service to iCloud. They call it iCloud Plus. And there are some other features for iCloud Plus, but a part of it is a VPN-like service for mail relays. Part of it is additional transparency. Now, look, I'll be honest with you. The problem I have is if Apple says that security is so important, why do they charge extra for those features? Really, if you're going to do security and make and say that it's important, I would think you want to make the security-based capabilities an essential part of any Apple service, and then figure out other ways to charge for additional services. I get that you want to add value to a service, and security is an interesting way to do it, but I don't know. To me, it feels a little counter to Apple's whole philosophy of being able to say, hey, security is critical for us, and that's what we want to be able to do. Anyway, last bit of news, of course, was macOS Monterey. And related to, well, actually, I should say that iPadOS 2, lots of things in iPadOS, widgets, better multitasking, the ability to do stuff with Apple Pencil that, frankly, Android's been able to do for years in terms of scribbling a note in there. But the cool thing about iPadOS and macOS was this feature that allowed, initially they called it continuity, but it's called universal control, that allows you essentially to share a mouse, for example, that goes from the macOS screen to an iPad that you put next to it. Now, the thing to remember is it's still running a macOS app in one place and an iPad OS app in another place, which is fundamentally different. So it's kind of it's not smoke and mirrors, but it's not quite the level of integration perhaps that some people think that it is. It's going to be interesting to see. It's still cool to see devices work together. Frankly, the obvious question is, hey, why didn't you extend that to iOS as well? I mean, if you got a big enough screen device, theoretically, you could even do that to iOS. But anyway, we'll see. I'm sure eventually they're going to move in that regard. But bottom line takeaway is, I think that the news from WWDC was interesting, but not completely revolutionary, even though Apple said, oh, it's our biggest ever, and maybe it is in terms of people, but the impact that the average user is going to have is going to be a little bit more modest. Well, one interesting thing, actually, one last point I did want to mention, again, they didn't talk about this originally, but as the news kind of evolved during the week, found out that some of the new macOS features are only going to work on their ARM-based M1 chips and any future chips that they are expected to unveil this fall. So some of the Intel-based Macs, which of course is 95+% of the install base at this point, will actually not get some of those features. They're relatively minor. It's not a big deal right now, but psychologically it's a big deal to see Apple saying, hey, this is yet another sign of how committed they are to making that transition to ARM-based M1s and the M1 family. And their implications for that long-term, I think, are going to be big. So that's certainly going to be interesting to watch. Switching gears entirely, we get to Cisco. The day after WWDC, Cisco had an event that they called Hybrid Work Made Real, and they unveiled a new version of Webex. Webex, of course, being Cisco's video conferencing application. But what they did is they announced something called Webex Studio. And I wrote about it in my column on LinkedIn. You can find it on LinkedIn. It also gets published on TechSpot and Seeking Alpha. The basic thing with Webex Studio is they've integrated something called Slido. And Slido is a polling and chat-based kind of it used to be an add-on to Webex. You used to have to run it separately. They've integrated that into the core application. They've also integrated their event capabilities that they are purchasing from another company called Socio into a single package, lowering the price. And importantly, and this is one of the big points I made in my column, is that they've dramatically lowered, basically cut in half the price of their video conferencing hardware. And, they've got all-in-one systems, they've got webcams, they've got room-based systems, and they're unique, by the way, in having both the hardware and the software versus the other companies Google's got a little bit of hardware, but not really much. Microsoft works with partners for hardware, same with Zoom. So Cisco's kind of unique in that regard. But this is important because as people start to return to the office, and oh, by the way, this is going to be a big deal and a big topic I'll be talking more about in future episodes of the podcast. One of the things that people are realizing is that video conferencing is going to be critical for almost every conference room in every building in the world, every business in the world. And probably less than 5% of those rooms are video conferencing equipped. Yet, Cisco talked at the event about the fact that 98% of meetings they expect to have at least one remote participant in once people return to the office. That basically means 100% of meeting rooms need to be equipped to handle that remote participant. Now, admittedly, a lot of them can just perhaps be audio, but we've gotten so used to doing video, so I'm doing a video podcast, that I think the expectations are going to be high. So lower cost hardware is actually another critically important part of the story. So certainly that video conferencing platform, collaboration platform business is incredibly competitive between Microsoft Teams and Zoom and Google Meet and all the other ones that are out there. So it's going to be an interesting area to watch, but it's clear that Cisco is very committed to doing this. They're committed to trying to make hybrid work for a lot of organizations. And with WebEx Teams and the new branding they launched and the new marketing they're announcing for it, they're clearly putting a lot of energy and effort behind it because they feel like it's a really big opportunity. So it's going to be really interesting to see. Then the last bit of news I was going to briefly cover is the fact that Verizon just unveiled the company's first, and I believe the first in the US, private 5G network business. So basically what they're saying is, hey, if you are a company and you want to set up a private 5G network for any type of application, they will do it. and it will use millimeter wave. And interestingly, there's been a number of challenges for millimeter wave when it comes to public 5G, because frankly, it doesn't transmit very far. But for an indoor application at a company, millimeter wave is ideal. So this is a great application. And what Verizon's going to do is license some of their, not license, they're going to use their own licensed spectrum that they already have and let companies use it. And then be able to manage it for them, combine that with their mobile access edge computing offerings. It's going to be really fascinating. And for the first interview I'm doing for the Everything Technology podcast, I had the chance to sit down with Sampath Sowmyanarayan. That's quite a mouthful, let me tell you, getting that one right. Anyway, Sampath's a great guy. He's the Chief Revenue Officer for Verizon Business. So let's cut to that interview now. Hello, everybody. I'm Bob O'Donnell, the President and Chief Analyst of TECHnalysis Research and the host of the new Everything Technology podcast. Really excited to have my first guest to talk about a subject that I absolutely love, and that's 5G. And just this week, Verizon announced their first offering for for private 5G networks in the enterprise, leveraging millimeter wave technology. And for those of you who've seen a lot of my writing and talking about 5G, millimeter wave is a really interesting, fascinating technology. Has had challenges, frankly, in the public internet, but for private networks, it's a slam dunk. So really interesting to hear. And I'm happy to be here with Sampath Sowmyanarayan, who is the Chief Revenue Officer for Verizon Business. So Sampath, thank you for joining the podcast. And give me a little overview of the news and what exactly is Verizon doing here?
Hey, Bob, super excited today. I'll tell you why. We've been waiting for this. This is a planned orchestration we've been doing for the last 2 years. We were the first carrier in the world to launch 5G. We were the first carrier to launch 5G home. And now we were the first to launch 5G mobile edge compute. And now one of the first carriers in the world to launch 5G indoor or 5G on-site. What does it mean? It means basically it's a private network just for you. You could be a warehouse, you could be a factory, you could be a venue, you could be a stadium, you could be a school, you could be a hospital. It's a private 5G network powered by Verizon that has the best that millimeter wave technology has to offer. What does it have to offer? Super high speeds. You can go up to 3-4 gigs of data, very, very low latency, very low battery throughput. So all the good things that we've been talking about 5G in an indoor environment. So we've launched that right now. We've partnered with Conning to do that. We've partnered with Ericsson to do that. But look, this is what we do best: build best networks on Earth.
And the fascinating thing about this this story and this what you guys are offering, it's a complete network. I mean, essentially, you're coming into these organizations, you're setting up a core network, you're setting up the RAN, the radio access network, and then letting people run applications on top of that. So look, there's a couple of interesting questions that come of that. First of course, there's been a lot of this notion of, we talked about briefly beforehand, a religious debate between 5G and Wi-Fi. I mean, is this meant to be a competitor to Wi-Fi, or do you see this as being a complement or more of a greenfield type of application?
Look, I don't see, there is no religious war between Wi-Fi and 5G. It's a very use case specific. Let's take in a hospital environment. When my kids, we are waiting to get them, checked up for their annual visit. The kids are watching Netflix. They're looking at their YouTube video. Wi-Fi works fine. It works really well for that. But do I want the EKG machines, the doctors' laptops, some of the more operating room theaters connected with Wi-Fi? Probably not. So a lot of it is use case dependent. 5G is super reliable. It's got the same consistency, quality of service, SLAs that we have, and it's in an indoor environment. So I don't think there's a religious war between the two. Both will coexist. Both will do really well. But we're pretty bullish about the use cases for 5G indoor right now.
And just to clarify, by the way, so it is indoor. This is not meant for campus-wide alternatives to Wi-Fi, for example, for companies who have outdoor environments like that. This is really for indoor applications.
Look, we can do those campus environments today. We do that at the stadium. I don't know if you watched the Super Bowl last. It was a great game, but more than being a great game, we had 5G millimeter wave covered in that stadium. In fact, most of the NFL stadiums, we have 5G millimeter wave. So getting it in an outdoor or a semi-outdoor environment is not rocket science. We figured it out. This one is indoor. So if you want to do it in a campus environment, which most of our use cases will be, that's par for the course for us. With the on-site stuff and some of the outdoor stuff we have, we can put that together very quickly.
And so if a company is interested in this, I mean, there's a couple interesting things to be aware of. First of all, this is not in unlicensed. This is actually part of the licensed bandwidth, or excuse me, spectrum that Verizon owns, right? You're simply able to reuse it in each of the different locations because of the fact that one of the benefits in this case of millimeter wave is that it doesn't propagate too far. So that leaves it enclosed within the environment. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's licensed spectrum. No one else has right to it. It's in this case, it's dedicated for that particular user in that indoor environment. That's why that's why you get consistency and reliability. You can never get that with unlicensed spectrum. You need that level of licensed spectrum to do that.
Yeah. And then physically, in terms of the equipment, I mean, as you and I were talking again just before we recorded this, so you essentially, Verizon comes in, installs core network equipment, a couple of servers. You've got radio access devices like hotspot type um, uh, access points, and then those are all connected together. And then, of course, then can connect to the company's corporate networks to run applications. Is that the basic structure of it?
That's it. You typically go into we call it a telco closet. It could be an engineering closet or a data closet, where you go, you have a couple of racks of data that has the core of the network in it. And then we have these access points, this size, maybe size of my head, maybe size of 1.5 times my head. And you just go, you clip it to the ceiling, you clip it to walls based on RF design, and you're up and running. It's pretty easy. It's pretty easy.
Pardon me. So, does Verizon manage that, or does the end user customer, or some combination? How do companies use the equipment?
Look, in a perfect scenario, we have something called network as a service, where the customer says, I want the network turned up. And we take care of everything: design, getting the field equipment, getting the equipment up and running, and then we manage it. So at 2 in the morning, if something goes down, we have people, we have automation, we have bots, we use a lot of AI, ML to manage those. It's a managed service. Well, some customers may say, hey, you know what, we'll manage this ourselves. That's fine. It's not dissimilar from networks we do today. The really large customers who we are really deeply engaged with rely on us for management, because it takes a fair amount of expertise, troubleshooting, but also scale. We can get people pretty much anywhere in the country in a couple of hours, just given our scale and size, and we want people to use that.
That makes sense. Now, one point I wanted to clarify on this announcement, because it was a little bit confusing, is you have sort of a combination of LTE and 5G. This is the core in this case is non-standalone, meaning the core portion of that private network is still running LTE, whereas the RAN, the physical connections, are 5G. Is that correct? And then will we see that update and change over time?
Yeah, Bob, one little nuance to it. The core, what we call the core, it's not running LTE. LTE is mostly an air interface. So it's running, the same core is running LTE and 5G.
Okay.
And then the air interface is all 5G. Now, why are we doing this? We want to get this technology to our customers today, because once you get to a standalone core, you may need new devices, new standards. We don't want to wait for that. You want to get the best of Verizon today. And look, it's going to take a while for standalone core to be up and running and tested. So for almost all use cases, this non-standard core works really, really well. And that's why we are very comfortable offering it right now. Lastly is, we don't want to strand devices. One of the things we also see is people may have older devices and stuff. So we don't want to strand devices. By putting this in this framework, we get maximum mileage out of the assets customers may have already bought.
Sure. Oh yeah. No, I mean that it completely makes sense. But the good thing is, if down the road people do want to upgrade that core, Verizon clearly is going to make a 5G standalone core available as part of the option, I would presume.
Definitely, we'll be the first to do that. But I see almost no use case that cannot be served in the current environment and architecture we have.
So speaking of use cases, what are the primary industries you think are going to, be interested, have a desire for this kind of service? What customers are you talking to that are saying, "Oh, I got to have this now"?
A lot of people come back to the office after their 15-month work from home, exercise. Well, I'm being generous by calling it an exercise. As people come back to the office, bandwidth needs are going to explode. So we're getting a lot of interest from the financial institutions saying, hey, come and put private networks on our trading floors. I'm on senior executive floors. We just want flawless connectivity. Simple use case, tactical, we can do it today. Then we're getting a lot of interest from mines. Mines are, yeah, I mean, as you know, in mines, they're either large, they're deep, or they're in a hole somewhere. So 5G was made for something like this. So a lot of interest in mines. Another one is stadiums, venues, where you just have a huge amount of device density. 50, 60,000 people show up, and nothing is more sucky than having the ability to upload to your Instagram. So that's another environment that we see. Hospitals, similar one, dense, a lot of device density there. And then we've started doing some work with the government as well. We've got a couple of the Air Force bases. The Air Force Station Miramar is one of them, where we've got some early versions of 5G up and running, and a lot of for defense applications.
One other another point I wanted to make, though, one of the things that people don't realize about private 5G, and this has nothing to do with Verizon, it's just the nature of private 5G. If you have a simultaneous network, you actually need two SIM cards in some of the devices. So if you wanted to talk to a public network, like the regular Verizon network, and the private network, you have to have a device that has two SIMs. Most people don't realize that a lot of modern devices, of course, have a physical SIM, then have an eSIM that can be reconfigured to use that. But that's a detail I think that gets overlooked a lot, and people, I think, just it's something you need to know if you're going to be, thinking about deploying some of these technologies.
Yeah, look, it is, but as you said, most devices today, all the iPhone families, all the Galaxy families, all tend to have two devices: one physical, the little chip thing you see, and then one is a eSIM, if you will. This, so nothing complex about that. Now, why do we do this? When we don't want visitors who come in from the outside to have access to your private network. We want to keep it safe. We want to keep it secure just for you. So we separate it. That's why it's so cool. The security that you get with private networks is unparalleled. Now, on the other hand, we want to allow people to go out. Let's say you're working on a device, you want to move it out somewhere. You can hop onto the Verizon network. That's one of the big advantages of versus Wi-Fi, because once you leave the prem, Wi-Fi doesn't work. Whereas we pop onto our network, it's a nationwide 5G. You can go coast to coast, north south, and you're going to just get flawless coverage. So that's some of the nuances. But yeah, two SIMs is something we're going to look for right now.
Yeah. Well, and again, one of the things that you point out is an important opportunity, and one of the real, I think, attractions of a private 5G network is the fact that it is more, it's secure inherently because you have to be authenticated on the network. A SIM card authenticates your device to, be on that network. And if there's no SIM card, you can't get on the network. As simple as that, as you pointed out. So that, I think, again, for a lot of industries, for a lot of organizations, that is not necessarily a negative, but actually a benefit. It's just you have to be aware of what the issues are in terms of dealing with that.
Yeah, I'll give you a good example, Bob, on that. WeWork. You have different companies. Like we are starting to deploy this at some of the big WeWork facilities. Why? Let's say I'm a Verizon employee. I go to a Manhattan WeWork office where we use them. I can literally walk into the office and I'm already on the Verizon network. I don't need any authentication because I'm already authenticated on the device.
Got it.
So the level of security and comfort is good. So WeWork is another place we've deployed it, rather in the process of deploying it to some of their top locations. Very excited because you get some early use cases as hybrid work its way through.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. And speaking of devices, obviously, we always tend to think about phones and mobile devices as the ones that are going to connect. But in a lot of these industrial applications, I mean, we're talking about robotic devices. They're moving through a factory, like in a warehouse, for example. What other kind of devices do you expect to see on these private 5G networks?
Look, anything that needs to be connected will be connected. I'll give you an example. Corning, one of the world's largest makers of fiber, highly precision, zero defect rate or close to zero defect rate. They use cameras to detect if there's a problem with the fiber as it rolls out of the mills. And we use 5G to do error correction, defects on that. It's on a camera. You can have it on robotics. You can have it on sensors. Anything that requires massive amounts of data at really quick time, that's where we deploy it. So it's not limited to phones and tablets and something in the middle there.
Yeah. And then last question I want to ask you is about building applications around this, right? So, I mean, the big for businesses, the connectivity is great, but at the end of the day, it's a means to an end. So, how, is Verizon thinking about packaging this connectivity solution with solutions that allow companies to build networks that take advantage of this connection?
Look, the peanut butter jelly analogy never runs old. So, and I'm going to bring it to use in 5G. You never thought anyone could do that, but let me try
All right.
this. Okay, we have a private 5G millimeter wave network. We also have the mobile edge compute. So essentially, it is a version of an Azure, or Microsoft, or in this case, we use AWS stack that runs at the edge. When you bring the two together, magic happens because you have a local storage compute that is linked to the Azure cloud or the AWS cloud, and you have the network that's zippy fast. So you can process applications so fast, so quickly. There's no other architecture can give you what that is. Now, that's the capability. We want our partners to build off these capabilities. So for example, if you're a hospital, you spend large amount of scans. Can you do, computer vision, error detection or things like that on your scans in real time in the hospital? You don't need to send it to a cloud and bring it back. Or using computer vision, you don't want to send sensitive security information across the network. So the magic happens is when you take the private network toward the mobile edge compute, you get 3-4 gigabit speed, up to 10 at some point. You also get really low latency. The number of applications is crazy high for that.
Got it. And to be clear, that Azure stack is running on that local core network that we talked about earlier in the discussion, correct?
Yeah, it could be running on that, or it could be running at the edge of our network too.
Got it.
Because think about it, that's the magic. Sometimes you don't necessarily have to do it in that prem. So we've got 10 locations in the country. We're going to get to 20 by the end of this year, maybe 50 by the time phase one is over, where we will co-locate with AWS deep equipment where you take our 5G core and their AWS and it's linked up. So you really don't have to host storage and compute in the factory. You can store it at the edge of our network. And what is cool is you don't have to rewrite the application for Verizon. You've already written the application for AWS or Azure. We just use that.
Got it. And you're the transport mechanism to take it from one place to the other. Perfect. Well, hey, Sampath, thank you so much for taking the time. Really great explanation of the technology that you guys are doing. I think private 5G is going to be an interesting one to watch. So best of luck with that.
Hey, thank you so much. I've not been this excited in a while. So thanks again. I'll stay in touch.
Sounds good. All right. You take care. All right. Again, Sampath Sowmyanarayan. That's a tough one. Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for tuning in to this first Everything Technology podcast. I still got a few technical issues I'm going to figure out to make this thing a little bit more refined, but I hope you enjoyed it. I'd love your feedback. Any thoughts or comments, please put them down below. If you'd like to subscribe, of course, I'd love to have you to subscribe to the channel. Just getting started here on YouTube. But let me know what you think. I want to make this something that you find useful. Again, that gives you some context and meaning around tech industry news. And I will look forward to speaking with you again next time. Thanks so much. Take care. I'm Bob O'Donnell, and I'll talk to you later.